Every morning before the sun came up, he disappeared. His kids thought he had one job. They had no idea what he was hiding. By 8 a.m., he was somebody else. A warehouse worker turned office dad in the time it took to change a shirt. To them, he was just dad, picking them up from an ordinary day. They never once suspected the mask he wore to protect them. While his children slept, he became a third person entirely. 2 jobs down. 1 more shift to go before sunrise. For 15 years, this was the only place he let himself break. Years later, his own children would uncover everything he sacrificed in silence.
If you have ever worked yourself to the bone for someone you love without ever telling them the price you paid, this story is going to break your heart and then put it back together. Stay until the very end, because the truth this family uncovers will change how you see every quiet, tired parent in your life. If stories like this move you, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel, because we tell one of these every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Daniel Carter was 31 years old when his wife, Maria, died in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of Springfield. He was left alone with 2 children, Ella, who was 6, and Noah, who was barely 2. The house they lived in had been bought with a business loan Daniel had taken out with his brother-in-law, Victor Hale, to open a small hardware store called Carter and Hale Supply. It was supposed to be the foundation of a stable, ordinary life. Instead, within a year of Maria's death, that foundation cracked in a way Daniel never saw coming. Victor had always been the smoother talker of the 2 men, the one who handled the books, the vendor, contracts, the taxes. Daniel trusted him completely, partly because Victor was family, and partly because grief had hollowed Daniel out so thoroughly that he barely had the strength to manage his own children's breakfast, let alone audit a ledger. It took 18 months for the truth to surface. Victor had been quietly siphoning money out of the business account into a shell investment fund, forging Daniel's signature on loan renewals, and letting the real debt balloon under Daniel's name while presenting fabricated profit reports to keep him calm. By the time the bank called about the missed payments, Victor had already sold his shares, paid off his own house in another town, and vanished from the community with a story about family circumstances. Daniel was left holding a business worth nothing and a debt worth everything. The betrayal cut deeper than the money alone. Victor had been at Daniel and Maria's wedding, had held baby Ella in the hospital the day she was born, had sat beside Daniel at Maria's funeral with his arm around his brother-in-law's shoulders, whispering that family looks after family, no matter what. It was that same closeness Victor had exploited, knowing Daniel would never think to question a man who had cried at his wife's graveside beside him. When the fraud finally surfaced in the bank's records, investigators at the time found that Victor had been diverting funds for nearly 2 years before Maria's death, meaning the business had already been hollowed out long before grief ever entered the picture. A detail that would take Daniel over a decade to fully learn, and even longer to fully accept. The store closed within the year. Daniel sat in an empty parking lot the day the locks were changed, Ella's hand in his, Noah asleep in a stroller, and he made a decision that would define the next 15 years of his life. He was not going to let his children feel the weight of what had happened. He was not going to let them see him break. He decided right there that whatever it took, however many hours, however many jobs, his kids would grow up believing their father was steady, present, and unshaken, even if that meant he had to become someone else entirely behind closed doors. What Daniel built after that was not 1 job, but 3, stacked on top of each other like a house of cards he refused to let anyone see wobble. In the mornings from 5 to 2, he worked the loading docks at a regional distribution warehouse, hauling pallets until his shoulders screamed. He told the kids it was an office job, and he changed out of his warehouse boots into a collared shirt, before picking them up from school, keeping a spare shirt folded in the truck for exactly that purpose. In the evenings, after homework and dinner and bedtime stories, once the house had gone quiet and the kids were asleep, he drove across town to a corporate office, building where he worked as a night janitor from 10 to 2 in the morning, emptying trash cans and waxing floors under fluorescent lights that made his eyes ache. On weekends, while the kids believed he was catching up on errands, he drove for a regional delivery service, dropping off packages from dawn until dusk, using the extra cash to cover school supplies, birthday parties, and the growing tutoring bills for Ella, who turned out to have a gift for mathematics that Daniel was determined to nurture, no matter the cost. He slept, on average, 4 hours a night. He kept a rotating cast of alarm clocks so that no single one failing would let him oversleep and miss a school drop-off. He memorized his children's schedules with a precision that bordered on obsession. Ella's science fair dates, Noah's soccer practices, the exact minute the school bus dropped them off so he could time his warehouse shift to end just in time to be standing in the driveway when they got home, tie loosened, looking for all the world like a man who had simply come home from a normal desk job. He built an entire architecture of small lies, not out of shame but out of love so fierce it frightened him sometimes. He wanted his children to have a childhood untouched by the betrayal that had gutted their family's finances. He wanted them to believe simply that their father was there, was fine, and was enough. For years it worked. Ella grew into a sharp, curious teenager who loved to solve equations for fun and dreamed of becoming an engineer. Noah grew into a quieter boy who found his voice on the soccer field, where his coach constantly praised his stamina and his refusal to ever ask to be substituted out of a game, no matter how tired he got. A trait so eerily similar to his father's that neighbors sometimes joked that Noah must have inherited his father's engine along with his eyes. Daniel attended every parent-teacher conference, every award ceremony, every Saturday morning soccer match, arriving with dark circles under his eyes that he explained away as bad sleep or getting older. He never once complained. He never once let either of his children see him cry, though there were nights, usually around 3 a.m. after his janitorial shift, when he sat alone in his truck in the driveway and did exactly that, silently, so the sound wouldn't carry through the walls. There were flashes of curiosity even in those early years. Small questions that a child asks and then forgets by the next morning. Once, when Ella was 11, she asked her father why he sometimes smelled like bleach when he tucked her into bed, and Daniel told her, without missing a beat, that the office building he worked in had just been cleaned that day. When Noah was 9, he asked why his father's truck always had an extra uniform shirt hanging behind the driver's seat, and Daniel said it was just in case of spills, which was, in its own strange way, not entirely a lie. Children accept explanations from parents they trust without needing them to be airtight, and Daniel understood that better than anyone, building each excuse just sturdy enough to survive a child's fleeting curiosity, never imagining that one day those same children would grow into adults capable of pulling every one of those small threads until the whole fabric came undone at once. The community around them, for what it was worth, always spoke well of Daniel Carter. Teachers described him as the most reliable single parent they had ever worked with, always early, always prepared, always calm under pressure. Neighbors borrowed his tools and never worried about returning them late, because Daniel never made anyone feel indebted to him. The owner of the corner diner where Daniel sometimes brought the kids for pancakes on rare Sunday mornings once told Ella years later, after the truth had come out, that she had always assumed Daniel worked something important downtown because of the quiet, steady dignity he carried. The kind of dignity, she said, that usually only comes from people who have survived something they never talk about. There were countless small moments during those years that, looked at individually, seemed unremarkable, but together formed the quiet architecture of Daniel's devotion. There was the Thanksgiving when Daniel worked a full warehouse shift, drove home, cooked an entire turkey dinner from a recipe his late wife had left behind in a spiral notebook, hosted 8 of Ella's friends for a sleepover, and then, once the house had gone dark and silent, changed into his uniform and drove across town to mop floors until 2 a.m, arriving home just in time to shower, and be standing at the stove making pancakes before either child woke up. There was the winter Ella's laptop died 2 weeks before her college application deadline, and Daniel picked up an extra delivery route every single day for 3 weeks straight, telling her only that he had gotten a bonus at work, so that she never had to know the new laptop had cost him nearly a month of sleep he did not have to spare. There was the summer Noah broke his ankle during a soccer tournament 2 states away, and Daniel drove through the night after his janitorial shift, sat in a plastic hospital chair until dawn, then drove straight to the warehouse without a single hour of sleep because he could not afford to miss the shift and he refused to let Noah see him worried. Daniel developed small rituals to keep the lie sustainable without ever feeling, to himself, like a lie at all. He kept a separate phone, an old model with a cracked screen, hidden in the glove box of his truck, used only to coordinate his warehouse and delivery schedules, so that the kids would never see a call come in from a supervisor at an odd hour and ask questions. He learned to nap in 12-minute increments in parking lots between shifts, setting a timer on his watch, training his body the way an athlete trains for endurance, because that, in a very real sense, was exactly what he had become. An endurance athlete of quiet, invisible love. He kept a small notebook, much like the one his late wife had left behind, where he wrote down, not complaints, but gratitude. One line most nights before he allowed himself to close his eyes. Things like, Ella got an A on her math test today, or Noah scored his first goal, anchoring himself to the reason he kept going every single time his body begged him to stop. The cracks began to show when Ella turned 20 and came home from her first year of engineering school for winter break. She noticed, for the first time with adult eyes rather than a child's trusting gaze, how her father's hands had changed. They were rougher than an office worker's hands had any right to be, calloused across. The palms in a pattern that looked less like typing and more like manual labor. She noticed the small burn scar near his wrist that he brushed off as an old thing, and the way he sometimes winced getting out of chairs, favoring his lower back. She said nothing at the time, filing it away the way people do when a small detail doesn't yet fit the story they've always believed. The real unraveling began 2 years later when Daniel collapsed at the distribution warehouse. During a double shift he had picked up to cover Noah's upcoming college application fees. He had not told anyone he was working a double. He had not told anyone he had been running on roughly 3 hours of sleep for the better part of a decade. His body, finally, simply refused to continue, and he went down between two loading pallets, waking up hours later in a hospital bed with a diagnosis of severe exhaustion, dangerously elevated blood pressure, and stress-related heart strain that the doctor said had likely been building for years. It was Ella, now 22 and home from her final year of college, who received the call from the hospital, since Daniel had listed her as his emergency contact years earlier and never updated it. She drove there with Noah, who was 18 and newly accepted to a state university on a partial soccer scholarship. Both of them terrified, both of them still believing as they walked through those sliding hospital doors that their father had collapsed at the office. It was a kind, exhausted nurse who first said the word warehouse out loud in front of them, assuming they already knew, and watched confusion spread across both of their faces like a slow-motion crack in glass. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Ella and Noah's lives, not because their father's health was in danger, though it was, but because the floor of their entire childhood shifted beneath them. Ella began asking questions. She tracked down Daniel's old coworker from the office building he had told them he worked at for 15 years, only to learn no such office existed under his name, and that address instead belonged to a corporate building whose night cleaning crew, when she called and described her father, remembered him instantly and fondly as Danny, the night guy who never missed a shift. Noah, digging through a box of old files in the garage while looking for insurance paperwork, found 3 years of pay stubs from a delivery company, a beat-up employee badge from the warehouse dated over a decade back, and a folder of unopened bank statements documenting a decade of a debt that traced back to something called Carter and Hale Supply, a business neither of them had ever heard their father mention by name. Ella sat in a hospital hallway that first night, phone in hand, replaying the nurse's words over and over. "Warehouse," the nurse had said. "He's one of our regulars from the loading dock incident, sweetheart. Sturdy guy, never complains." Ella had smiled politely, said nothing, and walked outside into the parking lot where she called Noah and simply said, "I don't think Dad works where we think he works." Noah, still holding his acceptance letter to the state university in his backpack, felt something cold settle in his stomach, the specific quiet dread of realizing that a story you have told yourself your entire life might not be true. What emerged, piece by piece, letter by letter, old photograph by old photograph, was the full shape of the sacrifice their father had made and hidden from them. For 15 years. Ella found an old newspaper clipping about the hardware store closing, with her father's name listed among the creditors owed money he never received. Noah found an old voicemail, saved on an ancient answering machine tucked in a closet, from Victor Hale himself, a wheedling apology recorded years ago and never returned, offering excuses instead of restitution. Together, sitting on their father's hospital room floor while he slept off his exhaustion in the bed beside them, brother and sister pieced together the story. Their uncle by marriage had stolen their father's business, buried him in debt, and vanished. And their father had responded not with revenge, not with collapse, not with bitterness passed down onto his children, but with 3 jobs and 15 years of silence so that his son and daughter would never have to carry a single ounce of the weight he carried every single day. When Daniel woke up and found both of his children sitting beside his hospital bed, faces pale with a mixture of grief, awe, and anger, he knew immediately, from the way Ella was holding the old newspaper clipping, that the architecture he had built so carefully for 15 years had finally come down. He did not deny it. He did not minimize it. Instead, for the first time in either of his children's memory, Daniel Carter told them the whole truth, start to finish, about Victor, about the store, about the debt, about the warehouse and the janitorial shift and the delivery route, about the 4 hours of sleep and the tears in the driveway at 3 a.m. that he had never let them hear. He told them he was not ashamed of the jobs, only afraid that, if they knew how hard things had truly been, they would grow up carrying guilt instead of childhoods, worry instead of ambition, and he had decided the day their mother died that he would rather bear every ounce of that weight alone than let it touch either of them. "Why didn't you tell us?" Ella finally asked, her voice cracking, the newspaper clipping trembling slightly in her hand. Daniel reached for her hand instead of answering right away, the same rough, calloused hand she had noticed years earlier without understanding why. "Because the day your mother died," he said quietly, "I promised myself you two would never have to grow up scared the way I was scared. Telling you would have meant asking you to carry some of that fear with me. I didn't want you to carry any of it, not 1 ounce." Noah, sitting on the other side of the bed, asked the question that had been eating at him since the garage discovery. "Did you ever think about just telling Uncle Victor's story to everyone, making him pay for what he did?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "For a long time, I was too tired to be angry. Anger takes energy I didn't have to spare. I put everything I had into you two instead. That felt like the better use of it." Ella cried harder than she had cried since her mother's funeral, not out of sadness alone, but out of a fierce protective anger on her father's behalf, an anger that quickly found a target, Victor Hale, who was, according to a public record search Ella ran that same week using skills she had picked up in a business law elective, still operating a mid-sized home renovation supply company 2 states away under a slightly altered name, seemingly prosperous, seemingly untouched by the wreckage he had left behind. Noah, quieter but no less resolved, spent that week making a list, the same methodical way he approached a soccer match strategy, of every document, every pay stub, every old bank statement that could help build a case. Neither of them wanted their father to spend 1 more year silently absorbing a debt that was never rightfully his. What followed was not a dramatic act of vengeance, but something Daniel would later say felt far more satisfying, patient, careful justice. Ella, now equipped with both her engineering degree and a stubborn refusal to let the matter drop, connected with a consumer fraud attorney who took the case pro bono after hearing the full story, moved by both the paper trail and the quiet dignity of the man at its center. Noah, meanwhile, tracked down 2 of the store's original vendors, men who remembered Daniel fondly and who had, unbeknownst to Daniel, always suspected something had gone wrong with the books years ago but had never had proof. Together, father, daughter, and son assembled a case, forged signatures, falsified profit statements, a paper trail of transferred funds that led directly to the house Victor had paid off in another town at the exact time Carter and Hale Supply had begun its collapse. There were setbacks along the way that tested all 3 of them. At one point, Victor's attorney sent a letter threatening a countersuit for defamation, and for 2 sleepless nights Daniel considered dropping the whole pursuit, telling Ella over the phone that he had lived without the money for 15 years and could live without it for 15 more if it meant protecting his children from a drawn-out legal battle. It was Ella this time who refused to back down, reminding her father in a tone that startled them both with how much it sounded like his own. "You spent 15 years protecting us from things we didn't need to carry. Let us carry this one. Let us do this for you." Noah, for his part, spent an entire weekend organizing every piece of evidence into a labeled binder for the attorney, the same disciplined focus he once poured into film study before a soccer match, determined that no detail would be overlooked. The legal process took the better part of a year. slow and unglamorous in the way real justice often is, full of depositions and document requests rather than the courtroom fireworks people imagine. But it worked. Victor Hale was found civilly liable for financial fraud and forgery, ordered to repay the debt he had engineered in Daniel's name with interest, and lost the very company he had built on the foundation of his betrayal. Since the fraud case became public enough that his own business partners in his new venture quietly severed ties rather than be associated with the scandal. Daniel did not ask for an apology, and Victor never offered one beyond a stiff, lawyer-drafted letter that Daniel read once, folded up, and placed in a drawer, choosing not to give it any more power over his life than it deserved. What mattered far more to Daniel than the settlement check, which he insisted on splitting evenly into college funds for both of his children's futures, was something that happened 3 months after the case closed. Ella, who had graduated and taken her first engineering job in the same city, insisted on taking her father to dinner at a modest but well-reviewed restaurant downtown, the kind of place Daniel would never have chosen for himself after years of counting every dollar out of habit. Over dinner, she slid an envelope across the table. Inside was not money, but a single piece of paper, a printed job offer letter, at Daniel's request, quietly arranged through Ella's new engineering firm's facilities management department, for a daytime maintenance supervisor position with full benefits, a real pension, and, for the first time in 15 years, a work schedule that started at 8 in the morning and ended at 5 in the evening, with weekends entirely free. Daniel read the letter twice before he understood what his daughter had done. He had spent 15 years hiding his exhaustion so his children could rest easy, and now, as adults, they had turned every ounce of that same fierce protectiveness back toward him. Noah, home from college for the summer and sitting across the table, added quietly that he had already blocked out every Saturday that fall to help Daniel finally fix up the house they had lived in all those years. The one with the leaking gutter Daniel had never had time to repair, because there had never been a Saturday that wasn't already spoken for by someone else's delivery route. The story that spread through their small community afterward was not really about Victor Hale's downfall, though people certainly talked about that too. It was about Daniel Carter, the quiet man who had worked 3 secret jobs for 15 years rather than let his children inherit a single sleepless night of his own, and about 2 young adults who, upon learning the truth, chose not pity but action, not bitterness but purpose, turning their father's silent sacrifice into a public reckoning and, eventually, into a well-earned rest that he had never once asked for himself. A year after the settlement, Ella organized a small gathering at the same house Daniel had refused to sell even during the worst of the debt. The house with the driveway where he had cried alone so many nights without anyone knowing. She invited the diner owner, 2 of the old vendors who had helped build the fraud case, Noah's college soccer coach, and a handful of neighbors who had known the family for years. There was no grand speech, no dramatic unveiling. Daniel simply stood in his own backyard, holding a plate of grilled food, surrounded by people who had known pieces of his story without ever knowing the whole of it, and for the first time in 15 years, he did not have to check his watch, calculate a shift, or measure his exhaustion against the hours left in the day. Ella watched him from across the yard, laughing at something the diner owner had said, and felt something settle in her chest that she later described to Noah as the first time she had ever truly seen her father look rested. Noah, for his part, still calls his father every Sunday from college, not out of obligation, but because he says he spent 18 years not knowing how much his father was carrying, and he intends to spend the rest of his life making sure he never has to carry anything that heavy alone again. Daniel, when asked by a local reporter covering the fraud case's resolution what he wanted people to take from his story, said simply that he never once regretted the 3 jobs, only the silence, and that if there was a lesson in any of it, it was that love sometimes looks like exhaustion nobody sees, and that the people who love us best are often stronger and far more perceptive than we ever give them credit for. Daniel Carter still keeps that old, faded warehouse employee badge in a drawer in his new office, not as a wound, but as a reminder of exactly how far love is willing to carry a person when no one else is watching. He tells people now, when they ask, that the 3 jobs were never really the sacrifice. The sacrifice was the silence, 15 years of it, and the greatest reward of his life was the day his own children broke that silence for him and gave him back, finally, the rest he had spent a decade and a half refusing to take for himself. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved the family who lived it, make sure you are subscribed, Because the next story we tell might just be the one that changes how you see your own parents, your own children, and every quiet sacrifice hiding in plain sight around you.